Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. Hello, everybody. I am Ross Morasso. Welcome to the show. I have my guest today, Sue Woodriffe, out of Portsmouth, UK. She is a therapist, both physical as well as for the mind, and runs a practice out of there for some, I'll say, unusual techniques. However, these therapeutic techniques have been in the works for decades and decades, and some of them sometimes for hundreds of years all over the world. But it may be some stuff that you have not come across as often. However, nonetheless, she is coming up with some very powerful results with her clients that she works with. Now, you can find her at suewoodriffe.co.uk, with Woodriffe being spelled Riffe. Sue, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Nice to be here today.
So, explain to us some of these techniques and practices that you employ with your clients and what sort of ailments that they might be assisting with, and, what sort of people that you do work with and why. I know it's a broad question, right? But give us an
Broad question.
overview of what you do.
Well, the people who come to me locally, I can do hands-on body work with Bowen, but that's not really much of an issue for most people because I've worked with a lot of people on Zoom for their emotional and mental problems and issues and their health problems and issues. So the hands-on stuff, as I said, is somebody has to be local. But the otherwise, the tools I generally use are EFT, which is tapping technique. I use Blast, which is a eye movement technique, which EDMR is maybe the most popular one that people have heard of, but it's been sort of moved on a bit, and Blast is another one. And I also use meta consciousness, where we look at the connection between the mind and the body and the emotional things that can kick off issues in the body.
Now, let me ask you about meta consciousness. So the word meta, especially since Facebook changed their name.
Well, that's a bit unfortunate.
Yeah. However, they were certainly not the first to come up with that. But I mean, you can hear it in video gaming and sports, the meta game, and all these sorts of things. So when you say
Meta
meta,
initially meant overview. When people did scientific research, they could do one of the things they could do would be a meta survey where they would look at all the papers published on a particular subject, and then it would be would be a meta review of the subject. So meta within the health profession has always been this overview, and in meta health and meta consciousness, we do look at we look down we do look at the broad picture. We home in on very specific issues, whether emotionally connected to the body, but we also look at the bigger picture of people's lives, their diets, their social life, their religious beliefs, their etc., because our vitality, which is part of all that, plays into our health.
there's a quote that you have said that you like from Carl Jung, and I feel like it's a little bit pertinent to what we're talking about right now. When the quote goes, and correct me if I mess this up a little bit, but until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder with meta consciousness if that is part of the component to getting the unconscious to become conscious. So what I'm asking is, when you talk about meta consciousness and someone says, I have a sore shoulder, the owie is here, mommy, as it were, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you look at a meta consciousness, if I'm understanding you right, you wouldn't just go, oh, well, then let me start working on your shoulder right now. That would be a very incomplete way to interact.
Well, some people who come to me just want me to fix their shoulder. But some people are more interested, or some people that come to me on Zoom and say they've got this problem with their shoulder. Then I would start looking into the emotional and do look into the emotional thing that's going on with the shoulder, which very much depends when I'm working with. And you've mentioned shoulder, so we'll stay with that. Is what movement? And you can do this with any musculoskeletal thing. What is the movement that hurts, and what does that movement mean to you?
Why I was thinking of this is that it's almost a joke in the broadcasting profession, and why I want to talk about metaconsciousness, how often broadcasters come down with laryngitis.
mm,
And, we all know that, laryngitis is, when you can't really speak and, you have issues with your
mm,
throat and voice and things like that. But really out in the world, how often do we run into somebody who had laryngitis? I mean, they almost use that in like comedy movies, and it can be a serious thing, but I mean, it's something that's unusual. However, fascinating that people who would talk for a living miraculously seem to have this higher rate, and we do, of
mm,
laryngitis. And so that got me thinking about metaconsciousness
mm,
in that interesting that laryngitis, using this example, also takes me out of practicing my profession for a while,
yes,
right?
yes,
My knee
mm,
doesn't hurt. I can still hobble over to the desk and then do the
mm,
news or something, right?
mm,
And so does
yes,
metaconsciousness then start to look at the deeper root
yes,
causes of the ailments?
that's correct. Yes.
So then how do you figure that out when you're working with a client?
Well, I can't really talk about other clients, so I'll talk to you about something that I've nearly completely resolved for myself. But
Mm-hmm.
when I was 8 years old, I started getting heartburn. I remember coming down to my mother and saying, "I've got this. I'm burning inside. I'm burning in my chest, Mum." And she goes, "You've got heartburn." And it's unusual to get heartburn when you're 8. And I carried on getting it. Um, and when I first started training in this thing, I remember saying to my tutor, "Well, I got heartburn when I was 8, but nothing happened when I was 8." And of course, it did. And
Mm.
I eventually found out what it was that happened, realized, remembered what it was that happened when I was 8. But for one reason or another, I ended up reading a book called The Torture of the Swastika. And I read about, at 8 years old, I was reading about Mengele and Butcher of Buchenwald and about people with gold teeth lining up being first in the gas chambers. And my dad had a gold tooth. And I lived in absolute fear for years. Every time I caught my dad, caught a glimpse of my dad's gold tooth, my first and instant reaction was, "Oh my God, he's going to be the first in the gas chambers." And at 8, I hadn't realised. Again, this is another thing about trauma, and this demonstrates it in a rather bizarre way. But a lot of things with trauma is that we don't move past it. We don't know it's ended. And at 8, I didn't really understand that this thing was in the past. Somehow I didn't. Somehow I thought it was still going on at some level, and so I've had this terrible fear that my dad would be the first of the gas chambers.
Of
And
course, you're reading this book though, and World War II, obviously, because the book was already written, it's long since
yes,
passed. But as an 8-year-old, you didn't really seem to have the temporal
didn't-
awareness.
no, no, I couldn't have. No, we don't have that till we're about 12. But our capacity to analyze and look at something logically doesn't kick in till we're about 12. So before that, we're really very much a sponge, and certainly up to sort of 7, 8, massively so, because of the way our brainwaves, the different types of brainwaves come in as we get older. So no, I couldn't work that out. Some part of me didn't work that out, and I was just totally stuck in this fear that my dad would be first in the gas chambers.
It's interesting you bring that up because that is an example of somebody using their imagination
Mm,
manifesting a
mm.
physical ailment, right?
Well, because what happens biologically, there is a biological reason why I got heartburn, and this is what we look at in metaconsciousness. Our bodies are speaking to us.
Mm.
But what happened was that it was something I couldn't digest. It was metaphorical, but I couldn't digest it. It was too big. It was too scary. It was too frightening. It was too much. I couldn't take it in. I couldn't digest it. So my stomach started making more acid to try and digest it. And that's when I ended up with the heartburn because I had too much acid. And also, that tissue is very much, it developed at the same time as the brain stem. So it's very much about safety. And of course, that was a big safety thing. I was in fear for my dad's life.
Meanwhile, he's going off and living his life, la di da da da, and there was no danger at all in
No,
reality.
my dad had no idea I was worried about his gold tooth. He just wasn't, he didn't have a clue.
This might be besides the point, but I'm curious as to how an 8-year-old gets their hands on such dense reading as that. Were you always drawn to such?
No, God, no, far from it. My brother was. And my brother found a book in a second-hand shop. And when our parents found out he had it, they went ballistic and said, "Do not show it to your sister," because I was
Which was
younger.
basically
And
saying, definitely show it to your
yes,
sister now,
because if
right?
I say you don't think about a pink mouse with blue ears, what do you think about?
Right.
So So he came up, he sneaked it into my room late one night and said to me, "Don't no, don't bother with that half the book. Start here." And I can still, in my mind, I can still see that first page, and I know what I read on it, and it's still there. I mean, it hasn't gone. The fact hasn't gone. But once I started processing the fear, and I didn't realize how bad it was until I started doing the work, how much fear there was in because of it in my still in my system, and
So
that was what carried on producing all this acid all the time.
now, how did you learn that it was this 8 year old experience that was causing you this heartburn and acid reflux?
Because I was 8 when I got the first symptom, so we knew it was something that happened around that time, and it's a stress thing. Producing acid, you do that when you're in stress.
So,
Some things, something we produce when we've had an acceptance about something, and we've gone into more into the rest and digest phase of our. But some things are in stress, and that kind of acid production is a stress thing. And I was in constant stress and fear.
so once you became aware that it was this a book from being 8 years old, could you
Mm.
now, as an adult, reflecting back, did it all of a sudden, was it like a veil being lifted, and now it was just so
But
obvious how that could
it
have
was an
been?
understanding of it, but until I started tapping on it, I didn't actually I didn't connect with that visceral fear that I had. That's interesting. I so used the word visceral as well, didn't I? I didn't really connect with it. I didn't understand how much it had affected me. I knew it did because I couldn't look at things. I couldn't look at things where people were horrible to people. I couldn't look at some of the television programs my family watched or just couldn't deal with them. And they didn't watch anything very terrible, but I just couldn't. I'd be the one curled up on the sofa going, with my eyes shut, going, "Tell me when it's over." And they
Mm.
would laugh at me because they'd say, "Well, you know, it's not that bad, Mum." It is. And it came from that, but I didn't understand how bad it was till I started tapping, and it all really came up from my unconscious, and I was in pieces, and I was in tears, and I was as an 8 year old in that fear, and that's when I really managed to process it, and that's when everything started to calm down after that.
So you're saying something that our listeners might not know what you're referring to. And for any of us who didn't catch us at the top of the show, I'm talking to Sue Woodriffe out of Portsmouth, UK, and she is a therapist for both the body and the mind, using some uh, not as conventional techniques, as I guess what I'll say, but it's unfair to say they're not conventional because people are millions are using them all over the world. And what you're talking about here, you say I started tapping on it. So
Yes.
yes, please explain what that actually is. Is that part of the emotional freedom technique?
Yes, the emotional freedom technique is often called tapping because we do tap. We tap with our fingers very gently on meridian points, mostly around the head and neck. And they are very specific meridian points. And there has been research to show that if you tap randomly, you don't get the same reduction in the stress hormones, which are easy to measure. So we do know that the points we're using matter.
And so you, in essence, were able to, using EFT,
Mm,
self-diagnosed yourself about your
yes.
8 year old experience.
But I did the work with a practitioner.
Oh, okay.
I didn't do that on my own.
So even though you are now, was this much earlier on in your career, or even today,
No.
if you felt, yeah, you,
Oh, if I, there's a lot I can do with myself, but I would still go to somebody for something big for me. I would still go, I still contact one of my colleagues and say, can we do a session on? And they do it to me, for me as well. If something's come up, can you do a session with me?
it's I asked that because there's Jack Nicklaus, who was a famous golfer, back in like the
Mm,
70s and 80s, who was famous for saying that despite having winning all these championships every season, he would go back to his instructor, and go after the basics
yes,
and everything else. So no matter how much we master things, and he was clearly a master at his activity,
yes.
that still having another human being there who is also a pro,
Mm, mm.
can still be necessary and helpful. And so when people work with you, is there a bit of a hybrid? So they'll do sessions, and it sounds like this EFT technique could be done virtually. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay,
I can do it on the video, yes. On video call, yes.
so they can work with you there, and then can they, to a lesser degree or in between sessions, continue to have these exercises?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I do ask people to do things between sessions, and some of that might involve some tapping. I also give them things that they can do to help themselves self-regulate, breathing, and various things that help with the vagal system to calm everything down, and certainly sometimes to carry on tapping on something that we've started working on.
Now,
But
and
not always, because if it's a big thing and there's a lot of unresolved stuff, I will say don't, wait till you're with me again because people can have very strong reaction to something, and you do need if that happens, you need to be with somebody who knows how to deal with it.
I find it fascinating that such a quote unquote simple technique, or maybe more
Mm,
like
mm,
non-invasive, right? Doesn't take a
yes,
lot of exertion, can have such
mm,
profound effects.
yes, it's extraordinary, but it does bring up. And I don't know that we understand enough yet about why or how, but it does bring up stuff from the unconscious, and it's extraordinary. It's amazing, and I've seen such big shifts in people
So if
when they tap.
along these lines, if somebody's been using more standard medicine, I have a I don't know if shoulder's the right way to go, but think about something like maybe our feet or knees or back, like more standard places that have like really long term neck, maybe
Mm,
ongoing chronic
mm,
pain.
mm.
And you've probably heard something like this. Someone finally calls you, "Oh, I've done everything. I've seen every doctor. I've had surgeries. I've gone to physical therapy and blah blah blah." Is that what would you say if you what sort of a setup that you is common that you'll hear from clients when you can start to think that your treatments are probably the next step for them?
It's often when they reach the end of the road, to be honest, when they really don't know what else to do, and everything else has failed them. Quite often, that's when they turn to somebody like me, and then we start looking for the emotional root cause of, and then if we can clear that, we can actually often clear the disease.
We end up in our life with pain, and especially when it comes to uh, spine and some of these places that we're talking about, the pain will seem like it's something very traditional, but then the MRI comes back, and the doctor is sort of like, it's
Mm,
unremarkable. I would just
mm, mm,
we don't see anything there, and the doctors often, I know there's several kinds of doctors, but still say, I believe you that you're in pain, but it could have them to be at a loss. And so even if they're not at the end of the road, if various usual suspects of an ailment turn out to be confirmed that they're not there, and
mm.
your primary care physician is now seeming to throwing you into a gambit of stuff, just try to explore things. You said you don't have to wait till the end of the line then, right? I mean, you can also
Well,
step
no,
in
you
at that
don't
point.
have to. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of people, there are a lot of people get pain for which there is no explained cause. They pain all over their body, and pain is a common one that they will get neck pain, back pain, whatever, knee pain. But when you do the X-rays and the scans, you can't see anything, and
And
then we
so people can
then
uncover like
yes,
these root causes, and then what the pain just sort of evaporates.
yes.
How quickly sometimes can this pain people could have
Well,
been
well,
dealing with for years?
it can be instant or it can take longer. It depends. It depends whether there's on one thing or whether there are layers and themes. Some people there's one thing. It's like the one thing that's tipped them over the edge, and it's on a theme of, and it's been a thing in their life, and then it can take it longer to unravel that one. But you can bring pain down with tapping, yes, definitely, and people do it all the time.
I ask because us Yanks are so me now, 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 now. It just seems to permeate our culture so much that it's nice to hear that there is a possibility for rapid relief depending on our
Mm.
situations.
It can be rapid, it can take time, and as I said, it depends how long something. It depends how long somebody's had it to some degree, and how much it's as I said, a one-off thing or whether a fits in with the theme.
Now, on a related note, you had talked about these meridians, but something we've talked about in the past is the fascia. And we've probably heard, a lot of us, the term fascia, the common one being plantar is fasciitis, right? So that's like issues like
Yes.
with our feet, but
Mm, mm.
our fascia is not just relegated to our foot. And when I've heard you mention this in the past, I was like, wait, what's that now? So explain to us what our fascia really is in our body and how it, affects and interacts with our whole body.
Well, next to your skin, it's the next biggest organ, and it's under your skin. You've got a lot of fascia in your in your buttocks. So next time your wife says, "Does my bum look big in this?" you could say, "You've got beautiful fascia, dear," and then you don't have to answer. So it's like if you're if you, when you feel, not that I am because I'm vegetarian, but I do remember my mother cleaning meat and there was this like white stuff in there. That's fascia. Tendons are fascia, ligaments are fascia, and there's this membrane. There's this in parts of our body. It's quite thick. There's a lot of it at the soles of the feet. That's why you get plantar fasciitis. But there's and it's around every membrane, it's around every muscle, it's around every muscle fiber. It's one of the reasons why we can move around freely and things don't stick together. So your liver and your stomach don't stick together because you've got fascia around both and they slide past each other.
So
So you
is
can
it
move
like a
this.
so is it slick? I mean, is that what it's designed to do? Is to keep everything?
It, it's partly it's designed to allow that to allow movement, freedom of movement, and partly where it becomes more of a it's always a connective tissue, but in places it's a really powerful connective tissue. So when it really condenses and becomes a tendon, then it's really part of your structural. It's structural as well as all the other things it does, and it's a huge. We don't know yet. We don't know yet what it does. There's like symposia on it running every now and then. Now we've started taking an interest. And it seems that there are receptors in the fascia. It's a form of communication around the body. It's really important that we keep it hydrated. And as a Bowen practitioner, I know that it's a really key part of how I work. And so often, where the where the problem presents is not where the problem is. So the classic one is hips and shoulders. So the minute somebody tells me they have a bad shoulder, as a burn practitioner, I look at their hips because it's quite often coming from the hips. And if you imagine trying to lift your arm up, but then you hold your shirt down by your hip, and you hold your shirt, you've got a long sleeve shirt, and you try and lift your arm up, you wouldn't be able to lift it, would you? Because you'd be pulling the material.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? So the face is like that. So sometimes when we have a restriction in the shoulder, it's due to a problem in the hip. Not always, but often. And
So
that's because the fascia is tight and there's a problem with the fascia.
is it correct to say then that if I tore a tendon, that it would also be true to say that you also tore part of your fascia? Like, are they all the
You
same?
could yeah, you could say that. Yes, it's all part of the same connective tissue. Yes, it's all connective tissue.
And so I
But
guess that then,
people don't normally call tendons fascia. They call them tendons because they are very specific aspects of the particular formation of the fascia.
now you had commented that our behinds have a very thick part of the
Yes,
fascia. How thick is it?
about 3 to 4 inches thick.
So, I mean, that's
Yes,
right. That
yes,
thick on our behind.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, that sounds like it. Now, are our muscles counted as part of the fascia?
No, but they're surrounded by it. So
Surrounded by it.
every muscle fiber's got fascia around it. Otherwise, all our muscle fibers, when your muscle contracts or relaxes, all the little fibers have to slide over each other. And if they weren't surrounded by this little membrane, this fascia, they wouldn't be able to slide. So you wouldn't be able to contract a muscle or relax a muscle because you wouldn't get that movement of the fibers over each other.
I wonder if this couldn't be quite frustrating for some doctors, right? Because now with this understanding, anytime we have pain anywhere, unless we're specifically bleeding from that part of our body, one would have to then say, well, it could be coming from anywhere. I mean, you couldn't discount, right, where the actual if injury or pain is
Mm,
truly sourced at, correct?
mm. Absolutely. And as you were saying about, sometimes if somebody has a bad back and they have all the scans and it doesn't show anything. Some people come to me and they say, they've said I've got a this and I've got a that in my vertebrae and blah blah blah. And I do Bowen on them. I do the work on them, and I don't really touch that, but it gets better. But they get better because actually the real problem is coming from somewhere else. So sometimes where we get the pain is not actually the point of origin of the problem, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. That's exactly, I think that's kind of been the theme a lot about what we've been
Mm,
talking about here today. So, does stretching And I can just say, at least the United States, we're just almost treat stretching as like a miracle cure for everything. However, I've learned recently that if everything else isn't working in the right way, sometimes stretching can actually be damaging. But is that a component to be able with when you're doing work with Bowen, or as a complement to it, or any other techniques that you do?
Well, I don't get people to stretch, but I'm more than happy if they go and do it with under supervision and they know what they're doing. I mean, yoga is a lot of yoga poses do and Pilates involves, as far as I know, involves some sort of stretching, and I'm sure it's good for us to keep everything moving. But again, like anything, you can overdo it or you can do it in the wrong way, and then you'll hurt yourself
So
or could hurt yourself.
when we are stretching our muscles out, that now sounds like, yes, I might be doing that, but I'm also now stretching the fascia. Like, can we make the
Yes,
fascia more
yes,
flexible?
yes. It is intrinsically flexible. It doesn't become unflexible unless it
Hmm.
becomes dehydrated. It's not. So hydration is important for keeping your fascia working well.
Do you know, speaking of hydration here, we're down to our last a few minutes here. It always goes by so quick, Sue. But in terms of hydration, how long does it take if someone was dehydrated? How long does it take the body to get itself rehydrated?
I'm not sure I can answer that because people aren't so dehydrated. We don't tend to meet people who are dying of thirst, and that's the
Right.
extreme dehydration. As a burn practitioner, I know when fascia gets a bit dried out or a bit challenged, I need to get it moving. I need to give it some encouragement, and then it can reabsorb the water that it needs. And so, when I
Hmm.
first had Bowen, I go home and drink 3 or 4 big glasses of water, just from one after the other, because my fascia had become dehydrated. But I wasn't aware of that as a feeling of thirst until I had Bowen, and suddenly my body was crying out for water.
Massage therapists will always tell us
Mm,
to drink a lot of water
drink
after a
water.
massage. And is that why?
Mm.
Because they've just now loosened everything up?
It's partly that, and also because as in massage, when you're doing deep massage, you start releasing toxins, and you want to flush those out of the system.
Got it. Okay, so tell us all before we go where everybody can find you.
Website is my name. It's Sue Woodriffe. So all one word, Sue SUEWOODRIFFE.co.uk. I'm in the UK. I'm in the South Coast, but I can work on video and I can do all the emotional, mental, the meta consciousness, look into the root causes of your illness. We can do all that on a video call.
Okay, and I'd like to tell our listeners, do a web search for Sue Woodriffe. You'll find that there are other interviews of her out there in addition to this one, and you can learn a lot more about what she does. Sue, it's very fascinating to talk with you as always. And once again, I find myself ending our show with more questions than answers. But I suppose that means you've done your job, at least for me today. So I do welcome you back anytime you wish to speak to us again. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
And thank you all for listening. I am Ross Marasso. You're getting used to hearing me say this. Until next time.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
Mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org. and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.